All right, so let's dive into a story that might just rewrite what you thought you knew about the Roman Empire. We're talking about a clash of civilizations, a cunning rebellion, and a defeat so shocking it sent tremors all the way back to Rome.
That's right. We're talking about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, a turning point in Roman history, and a story that reminds us that even the mightiest empires, have their vulnerabilities.
You know, it's fascinating to think about what life must have been like for a Roman soldier stationed on the edges of their vast empire, especially in a place like Germania, a land that the Romans viewed as, well, a cold, wet, barbarian-filled wilderness.
And you have to remember, for the people who called Germania home, it wasn't a wilderness at all. It was a place of freedom, a network of independent tribes with their own customs and loyalties, fiercely protective of their way of life.
It's like two completely different worlds colliding, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We'll be exploring how the Romans viewed Germania through the writings of Tacitus, their ambitious campaigns to conquer it, and the intricate strategies they used to jail control it.
We'll also delve into the growing tensions between the Romans and the Germanic tribes, and the simmering resentment that eventually boiled over, culminating in one of the most stunning defeats in Roman military history.
Now, our sources paint a pretty vivid picture of how the Romans saw Germania and its people. Tacitus, for instance, describes the Germans as fierce warriors with blue eyes, reddish hair, and this deep-seated love of freedom. He talks about them living in small villages scattered across a landscape dominated by dense forests and swamps, a far cry from the structured urban life of the Romans.
It was a clash of cultures on a fundamental level. You see, the Romans, they prided themselves on their cities, their laws, their advanced infrastructure. They saw themselves as the bringers of civilization. And to them, anyone outside their cultural sphere, like the Germanic tribes, were considered barbarians.
Right. It's important to remember, though, that barbarian was a Roman label, a way of othering those who were different. I mean, the Germanic tribes had their own complex social structures, beliefs, and traditions. They weren't simply uncivilized, they were different.
Exactly. And those differences fueled the Roman desire to conquer and reshape Germania in their own image. They saw it as their duty to bring civilization to these uncivilized people.
So how did these two worlds collide? Well, the Romans had been pushing their borders eastward for decades, and Germania, with its strategic location along the Rhine River, became a prime target for expansion.
And let's not forget the history of conflict between the Romans and the Germanic tribes. There were earlier clashes, like the Cimbrian War, and that devastating Germanic raid into Roman territory in 16 BC. An entire Roman legion was wiped out.
Wow, that raid must have been a real wake-up call for the Romans. I bet it fueled their desire to conquer this region once and for all.
Absolutely. It solidified their perception of the Germanic tribes as a threat that needed to be dealt with.
So they launched a series of campaigns utilizing those major rivers, like the Lippe, for transportation and logistics. They established forts along the way, like the one at Haltern am See, which archaeologists believe was the Roman fort of Aliso, to solidify their control. And of course, they employed that classic strategy divide and conquer.
Right. They expertly exploited the rivalries that already existed between the various Germanic tribes, pitting one tribe against another and gradually expanding their influence and control over the region.
It was a brutal but effective tactic. They would ally themselves with one tribe to defeat another, then turn on their former ally once the threat from the other tribe was neutralized. The Romans weren't shy about using force to reshape the region, forcibly resettling entire tribes and imposing their vision of order on the land. They envisioned creating a Roman province out of Germania, Germania Magna, they called it.
And that's where Arminius enters the picture. He was a Cherushi nobleman, taken hostage by the Romans as a child. Think about that for a moment. A young boy taken from his home and family, raised in the heart of the Roman Empire.
It's hard to imagine what that must have been like, to be immersed in a completely different culture, to be trained in Roman military tactics, and to rise through the ranks of their army.
And to the Romans, he was the perfect example of a Romanized barbarian, someone they could mold and trust to help them govern Germania. He even served as an officer in the Roman auxiliary forces, demonstrating his loyalty and skill.
But as we'll see, Arminius was playing a much deeper game. He witnessed the brutality of Roman rule firsthand, the resentment it caused among his people. He learned Roman military tactics, but he also learned their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. All the while, he was secretly plotting to use that knowledge against them.
He was a double agent, a man caught between two worlds, carefully navigating a dangerous path.
Talk about walking a tightrope. And now, enter Publius Quintilius Varus, the Roman governor of Germania appointed by Augustus himself. Varus was known as a skilled politician and administrator, but not necessarily a seasoned military commander.
And this is crucial because he completely trusted Arminius. He saw him as a loyal ally and advisor, a fatal misjudgment, as we'll soon discover.
Now, the Cherusi, Arminius's tribe, were considered one of the most loyal Germanic tribes to Rome. So when Varus chose to establish his summer camp in their territory, it seemed like a perfectly safe and reasonable decision.
And this seemingly innocuous choice played right into Arminius's hands. It allowed him to further consolidate his power within the tribe and position himself to strike at the heart of the Roman presence in Germania.
Meanwhile, the seeds of rebellion were already being sown. Arminius, using his position of trust, began to subtly influence Roman strategy, nudging Varus towards decisions that would ultimately benefit the rebellion he was planning. And he had another factor working in his favor: timing.
Remember the Illyrian revolt that was happening down in the Balkans? Well, that massive uprising had drawn Roman legions away from Germania, leaving the region vulnerable. It was a perfect opportunity for Arminius to exploit this weakness.
So he concocted a story about a minor uprising further west, convincing Varus that he needed to march deeper into Germania to put it down. Of course, this was all a ruse, a carefully calculated lie to lure the Roman legions right into the trap Arminius was setting.
But here's where things get even more interesting. Remember Segestes, the Cherusi nobleman? Well, he was vehemently opposed to Arminius, particularly after Arminius eloped with his daughter against his wishes.
Oh yes, Segestes. He was furious with Arminius.
Right. And Segestes actually tried to warn Varus about Arminius's treachery. He went directly to the Roman camp and urged Varus to arrest Arminius.
But Varus, blinded by his trust in Arminius, dismissed the warning out of hand. He saw it as a personal vendetta fueled by Segestes' anger over his daughter. Imagine that. Choosing to trust the man who had seemingly embraced Roman culture over the one who had remained true to his Germanic roots.
It's a classic tale of misplaced trust and underestimation. And to make matters worse, Varus decided to bring his entire army on this supposed mission to crush the rebellion. That included not just the legionaries, but also the camp followers, the women, children, and servants who traveled with the army.
Wow. That would have made his force incredibly slow and cumbersome. An easy target for the ambush that Arminius was planning. Talk about playing right into the enemy's hands.
And then, in a final act of deception, Arminius left Varus's camp under the guise of gathering Cherusi warriors to support the Roman advance. In reality, he was leading the Roman army step by step deeper into the Teutoburg forest, a place that would soon become their graveyard.
It's chilling to think about. This seemingly invincible Roman army marching blindly into a trap, orchestrated by a man they believed was their loyal ally. And with that final act of betrayal, the stage is set for a clash of civilizations that will change the course of history.
Welcome back. As we left off, Varus and his legions were marching deeper into Germania, completely unaware of the trap that Arminius had so cleverly laid for them.
You know, I keep thinking about that Roman column stretching out for miles through that dense ancient forest. The air must have been so thick with anticipation, and maybe even a little unease as they ventured further into, well, unknown territory.
And the terrain itself was a formidable foe. The Teutoburg forest was a tangled wilderness, narrow paths, thick woods, and treacherous bogs. The perfect setting for an ambush, allowing the Germanic warriors to utilize the landscape to their advantage.
So how did the ambush actually begin? What were those first terrifying moments like when the Roman legions realized they were in serious trouble?
Okay, picture this. It's early September, the air is damp and heavy, and the Roman column is slowly snaking its way through the forest. Suddenly, from the dense undergrowth, a hail of spears and javelins rains down upon them. Germanic warriors hidden amongst the trees unleash a devastating attack, focusing on the Roman soldiers caught off guard in the narrow paths.
Oh, it must have been absolute chaos. I can only imagine the panic that gripped the Roman ranks. You know, they were used to fighting in open formations, relying on their discipline and superior weaponry to overcome their foes. But here in the close confines of the forest, their usual tactics were useless.
Absolutely. The initial attack was only the beginning. The Germanic tribes, emboldened by their early success, pressed their advantage. They employed hit-and-run tactics, swarming out from the trees to attack isolated groups of Roman soldiers, then melting back into the forest before the Romans could effectively regroup and respond.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare for the Romans. Completely outmaneuvered, their formations shattered, their discipline crumbling under this relentless assault. What about the camp followers? Weren't there women and children traveling with the army?
You're right. Varus had made the fateful decision to bring the entire Roman army on this march,
Yeah.
including all of the camp followers. So not only were their legionaries caught in this brutal ambush, but also women, children, and servants.
It's heartbreaking to even think about. Their presence must have made the Roman army even more vulnerable, hindering their ability to defend themselves and adding to the chaos.
Absolutely. The Germanic warriors knew that the Romans were burdened by a large baggage train and civilians, and they expertly exploited this weakness. They targeted the camp followers, which added to the panic and confusion among the Roman ranks.
So the Romans are trapped. Their formations are broken, their morale is plummeting, and they're facing a relentless enemy who knows the terrain intimately and is fighting with the ferocity of, well, those defending their homeland. How did Varus respond? Did he manage to regain control of the situation?
Well, initially, Varus was completely caught off guard. He struggled to mount an effective counterattack. He likely tried to rally his troops to reform their lines, but the dense forest and the constant attacks made it almost impossible. You have to remember, Varus was not a seasoned military commander. He was used to the world of Roman politics and administration, not the brutal reality of a forest ambush.
It sounds like he was completely out of his depth, facing a situation that would have challenged even the most experienced Roman general. What happened next? Did the Romans manage to hold out, or did the ambush just continue to escalate?
The ambush continued relentlessly. For days, it was a brutal, grinding onslaught that just chipped away at the Roman forces. Imagine the terror, the exhaustion, the growing despair as the Roman soldiers began to realize the true extent of their predicament. They weren't facing a minor uprising as they had been led to believe. This was a full-scale rebellion, orchestrated by a man they had considered one of their own.
A betrayal of epic proportions. And the fact that this was all taking place in this dark, unforgiving forest, so far from the familiar battlefields of the Roman world, must have added to the horror of the experience. The Romans were known for their resilience, though, their ability to adapt and overcome even the most daunting challenges. Did they find a way to break free from the trap?
They tried to. Varus, realizing just how desperate their situation was, ordered his men to build a fortified camp. He was hoping to create a defensive position where they could regroup and withstand the attacks.
A classic Roman tactic. They were masters of fortification, able to construct defensible positions even in the most hostile environments.
Did it work? Well, the Teutoburg forest was no ordinary battlefield. The terrain, the constant harassment, and the sheer number of Germanic warriors surrounding them made it nearly impossible to build a truly secure and defensible position. The Romans were also battling the elements. The sources describe heavy rains that turned the already difficult terrain into a muddy quagmire, further hampering their movements and, well, destroying their morale.
The rain must have been a nightmare for the Romans,
Yeah.
especially with their heavy armor and equipment. Every movement would have been a struggle. But the Germanic warriors, more lightly equipped and used to the terrain, wouldn't have been as affected. It's almost as if the forest itself was fighting on their side.
Exactly. And as the days wore on, the situation for the Romans grew increasingly desperate. Their supplies dwindled, their wounded multiplied, and their hope of rescue faded with each passing hour. Varus, facing the crushing weight of this defeat, is said to have taken his own life rather than face capture and humiliation at the hands of his former ally.
A tragic end for a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Roman power. His death must have sent shockwaves through the remaining Roman ranks. What happened to the soldiers? Did any of them manage to escape the forest, or was their fate sealed? It's hard to imagine the despair that must have gripped those remaining Roman soldiers, that their commander was gone. Their situation seemed hopeless, and they were surrounded by a relentless enemy and a hostile, unforgiving landscape.
It was absolute chaos. Some of the Roman legions, they fought on with incredible courage, fueled by desperation, while others tried to flee, but the dense forest and the pursuing Germanic warriors, well, they made escape almost impossible.
It must have been a scene of unimaginable carnage. Those Roman soldiers, once the embodiment of order and discipline, now scattered and broken, fighting for their lives in a desperate last stand. What happened to the Roman eagles? Those golden standards, the ones that were so important to the legions, symbols of their might and power.
The Germanic tribes captured them. It was a devastating blow to Roman pride, a powerful symbol of their utter defeat.
Can you imagine the impact this must have had on Rome? To have 3 entire legions wiped out, along with countless auxiliary troops and camp followers, their standards captured by the enemy. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a catastrophe.
It sent shockwaves throughout the Roman Empire. It challenged their sense of invincibility, exposed the limits of their power. When the news reached Augustus back in Rome, he's said to have wandered his palace, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions."
Wow, that's a powerful image. You can really feel the depth of Roman despair in that moment. It's like their entire worldview was shaken. Their empire, for all its might, was not invincible. How did Rome respond to this disaster? Did they abandon their plans to conquer Germania altogether?
Not entirely. The Romans, under the command of Tiberius, who was Augustus's stepson and heir, they launched these punitive expeditions back into Germania, driven by a desire for revenge, to punish the Germanic tribes for their audacious victory and to recover those lost eagles. They did inflict heavy losses on the tribes, but they never again tried to fully conquer and occupy the region east of the Rhine.
So the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was a decisive turning point in Roman history. It's amazing to think that a single battle, fought in a remote forest, could have such a profound impact on the course of an empire. What about Arminius? What happened to the man who orchestrated this stunning victory?
Arminius became a legend among the Germanic tribes, a symbol of resistance against Roman domination. But his victory came at a personal cost. He faced increasing opposition from some within his own tribe, who saw him as a traitor to Rome. He was eventually assassinated by members of his own family, his legacy forever intertwined with both triumph and tragedy.
It's a fascinating and complex story, isn't it? It really makes you think about the nature of loyalty, identity, and the sacrifices people are willing to make, the sacrifices they make in the pursuit of freedom.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history is rarely black and white. There are shades of gray, layers of complexity, and often the most captivating stories are those that defy easy categorization.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, what are some of the key takeaways we can glean from this pivotal event? You know, it's a story that's captivated historians and storytellers for centuries, and for good reason. There are lessons to be learned here about the dangers of underestimating your opponent, about the importance of adaptability, and about the limits of power, even for empires as vast and mighty as Rome.
On a tactical level, the battle highlights the importance of understanding the terrain, the need to adapt your strategies to the environment. The Romans, accustomed to fighting in open battlefields, they were completely outmaneuvered and overwhelmed in the dense, unforgiving terrain of the Teutoburg Forest.
It also serves as a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires are not invincible. Their arrogance, their rigid adherence to traditional tactics, and their underestimation of the Germanic tribes' capabilities all contributed to their downfall.
And finally, the story of Arminius. It raises questions about the complexities of identity, loyalty, and the pursuit of freedom. He was a man caught between two worlds, forced to make impossible choices that ultimately led to both his greatest triumph and his tragic demise.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically about the motivations of these historical figures and the forces that shape the course of empires and civilizations. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and names, but a tapestry of human stories filled with drama, intrigue, and lessons that resonate even today.